The Mexican-American War Part 2, 1846 to 1848, Battles on the Rio Grande. U.S. invasions on Mexico's periphery. New Mexico Campaign ***. After the declaration of war on May 13, 1846, United States Army General Stephen W. Kearny moved southwest from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. In June 1846, with about 1,700 men in his Army of the West, Kearny's orders were to secure the territories Nuevo Mexico and Alta California. In Santa Fe, Governor Manuel Armijo wanted to avoid battle, but on August 9th, Colonel Diego Archuleta and militia officers Manuel Chaves and Miguel Pino forced him to muster a defense. Armijo set up a position in Apache Canyon, a narrow pass about 10 miles, 16 kilometers southeast of the city. However, on August 14th, before the American army was even in view, he decided not to fight. An American named James McGoffin claimed he had convinced Armijo and Archuleta to follow this course. An unverified story says he bribed Armijo when Pino Chaves and some of the militiamen insisted on fighting. Armijo ordered the cannon pointed at them. The new Mexican army retreated to Santa Fe, and Armijo fled to Chihuahua. Kearny and his troops encountered no Mexican forces when they arrived on August 15th. Kearny and his force entered Santa Fe and claimed the New Mexico territory for the United States without a shot fired. Kearny declared himself the military governor of the New Mexico territory on August 18th and established a civilian government. American officers drew up a temporary legal system for the territory called the Kearny Code. Kearny then took the remainder of his army west to Alta California. He left Colonel Sterling Price in command of U.S. forces in New Mexico. He appointed Charles Bent as New Mexico's first territorial governor. Following Kearny's departure, dissenters in Santa Fe plotted a Christmas uprising. When the plans were discovered by the U.S. authorities, the dissenters postponed the uprising. They attracted numerous native allies, including Puebloans, who also wanted to push the Americans from the territory. On the morning of January 19, 1847, the insurrectionists began the revolt in Don Fernando de Taos, present-day Taos, New Mexico, which later gave it the name the Taos Revolt. They were led by Pablo Montoya, a New Mexican, and Tomas Romero, a Tos Pueblo native, also known as Tomasito Little Thomas. Romero led a Native American force to Bent's house, where they broke down the door, shot Bent with arrows, and scalped him in front of his family. They moved on, leaving Bent still alive, with his wife Ignacia and children, and the wives of friends Kit Carson and Thomas Boggs. The group escaped by digging through the adobe walls of their house into the one next door. When the insurgents discovered the party, they killed Bent but left the women and children unharmed. The next day, a large armed force of approximately 500 New Mexicans and Pueblo attacked and laid siege to Simeon Turley's mill in Arroyo Hondo, several miles outside of Taos. Charles Autobes, an employee at the mill, saw the men coming. He rode to Santa Fe for help from the occupying U.S. forces. 8 to 10 mountain men were left at the mill for defense. After a day-long battle, only 2 of the mountain men survived: John David Albert and Thomas Tate Tobin, Autobes' half-brother. Both escaped separately on foot during the night. The same day, New Mexican insurgents killed 7 American traders passing through the village of Mora. At most, 15 Americans were killed in both actions on January 20th. The U.S. military moved quickly to quash the revolt. Colonel Price led more than 300 U.S. troops from Santa Fe to Taos, together with 65 volunteers, including a few New Mexicans, organized by Saren St. Vrain, the business partner of William and Charles Bent. Along the way, the combined forces beat back a force of some 1,500 New Mexicans and Pueblo at Santa Cruz de la Cagada and at Embudo Pass. The insurgents retreated to Taos Pueblo, where they took refuge in the thick-walled adobe church. During the ensuing battle, the U.S. breached a wall of the church and directed cannon fire into the interior, inflicting many casualties and killing about 150 rebels. They captured 400 more men after close hand-to-hand fighting. Only 7 Americans died in the battle. A separate force of U.S. troops under captains Israel R. Hendley and Jesse I. Maureen campaigned against the rebels in Mora. The First Battle of Mora ended in a New Mexican victory. The Americans attacked again in the Second Battle of Mora and won, which ended their operations against Mora. New Mexican rebels engaged U.S. forces 3 more times in the following months. The actions are known as the Battle of Red River Canyon, the Battle of Las Vegas, and the Battle of Cienega Creek. California Campaign Word of Congress Declaration of War reached California by August 1846. American Consul Thomas O. Larkin, stationed in Monterey, worked successfully during the events in that vicinity to avoid bloodshed between Americans and the Mexican military garrison commanded by General Jose Castro, the senior military officer in California. Fremont, leading a U.S. Army topographical expedition to survey the Great Basin, entered Sacramento Valley in December 1845. Fremont's party was at Upper Klamath Lake in the Oregon Territory when it received word that war between Mexico and the U.S. was imminent. 139. The party then returned to California. Mexico had issued a proclamation that non-naturalized foreigners were no longer permitted to own land in California and were subject to expulsion. With rumors swirling that General Castro was massing an army against them, American settlers in the Sacramento Valley banded together to meet the threat. On June 14, 1846, 34 American settlers seized control of the undefended Mexican government outpost of Sonoma to forestall Castro's plans. 1. Settler created the Bear flag and raised it over Sonoma Plaza. Within a week, 70 more volunteers joined the rebels' force, which grew to nearly 300 in early July. 145. This event, led by William B. Ide, became known as the Bear Flag Revolt. On June 25. Fremont's party arrived to assist in an expected military confrontation. San Francisco, then called Yerba Buena, was occupied by the Bear Flaggers on July 2nd. On July 5th, Fremont's California Battalion was formed by combining his forces with many of the rebels. Commodore John D. Sloat, commander of the U.S. Navy's Pacific Squadron near Mazatlan, Mexico, had received orders to seize San Francisco Bay and blockade California ports when he was positive that war had begun. Sloat set sail for Monterey, reaching it on July 1st. 150 Sloat, upon hearing of the events in Sonoma and Fremont's involvement, erroneously believed Fremont to be acting on orders from Washington and ordered his forces to occupy Monterey on July 7th and raise the U.S. flag. On July 9th, 70 sailors and Marines landed at Yerba Buena and raised the American flag. Later that day in Sonoma, the Bear flag was lowered, and the American flag was raised in its place. On Sloat's orders, Fremont brought 160 volunteers to Monterey, in addition to the California Battalion. On July 15th, Sloat transferred his command of the Pacific Squadron to Commodore Robert F. Stockton, who was more militarily aggressive. He mustered the willing members of the California Battalion into military service with Fremont in command. Stockton ordered Fremont to San Diego to prepare to move northward to Los Angeles. As Fremont landed, Stockton's 360 men arrived in San Pedro, Castro, and Pico, wrote farewells, and fled separately to the Mexican state of Sonora. Stockton's army entered Los Angeles unopposed on August 13th, whereupon he sent a report to the Secretary of State that California is entirely free from Mexican dominion. Stockton, however, left a tyrannical officer in charge of Los Angeles with a small force. The Californios, under the leadership of José María Flores, acting on their own and without federal help from Mexico, in the siege of Los Angeles, forced the American garrison to retreat on September 29th. They also forced small U.S. garrisons in San Diego and Santa Barbara to flee. Asterisk, Captain William Murphy landed 350 sailors and Marines at San Pedro on October 7. They were ambushed and repulsed at the Battle of Dominguez Rancho by Flores forces in less than an hour. 4 Americans died, with 8 severely injured. Stockton arrived with reinforcements at San Pedro, which increased the American forces there to 800. He and Mervyn then set up a base of operations at San Diego. Meanwhile, Kearny and his force of about 115 men, who had performed a grueling march across the Sonoran Desert, crossed the Colorado River in late November, 1846. Stockton sent a 35-man patrol from San Diego to meet them. On December 7th, 100 Lancers, under General Andres Pico, brother of the governor, tipped off and lying in wait, fought Kearny's army of about 150 at the Battle of San Pasqual, or 22 of Kearny's men, one of whom later died of wounds, including 3 officers, were killed in 30 minutes of fighting. The wounded Kearny and his bloodied force pushed on until they had to establish a defensive position on Mule Hill. However, General Pico kept the hill under siege for 4 days until a 215-man American relief force arrived. Asterisk, Fremont and the 428-man California Battalion arrived in San Luis Obispo on December 14th and Santa Barbara on December 27th. On December 28th, a 600-man American force under Kearny began a 150-mile march to Los Angeles. Flores then moved his ill-equipped 500-man force to a 50-foot-high bluff above the San Gabriel River. On January 8, 1847, the Stockton-Kearny Army defeated the Californio force in the 2-hour Battle of Rio San Gabriel that same day. Fremont's force arrived at San Fernando. The next day, January 9th, the Stockton-Kearny forces fought and won the Battle of La Mesa. On January 10th, the U.S. Army entered Los Angeles to no resistance. On January 12th, Fremont and 2 of Pico's officers agreed to terms for a surrender. Articles of capitulation were signed on January 13th by Fremont, Andres Pico, and 6 others at a ranch at Cahuenga, past modern-day North Hollywood. This became known as the Treaty of Cahuenga, which marked the end of armed resistance in California. Pacific Coast Campaign entering the Gulf of California. Independence, Congress, and Siani seized La Paz, then captured and burned the small Mexican fleet at Guimos on October 19, 1847. Within a month, they cleared the Gulf of hostile ships, destroying or capturing 30 vessels. Later, their sailors and Marines captured the port of Mazatlan on November 11, 1847. After Upper California was secure, most of the Pacific Squadron proceeded down the California coast, capturing all major cities of the Baja California Territory, and capturing or destroying nearly all Mexican vessels in the Gulf of California. A Mexican campaign under Manuel Pineda Muñoz to retake the various captured ports resulted in several small clashes and 2 sieges in which the Pacific Squadron ships provided artillery support. U.S. garrisons remained in control of the ports. Following reinforcement, Lt. Cal. Henry S. Burton marched out. His forces rescued captured Americans, captured Pineda, and on March 31st defeated and dispersed remaining Mexican forces at the skirmish of Todos Santos. Unaware that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had been signed in February 1848 and a truce agreed to on March 6, when the U.S. garrisons were evacuated to Monterrey following the treaty ratification. Many Mexicans went with them. Those who had supported the U.S. cause and had thought Lower California would also be annexed along with Upper California, Northeastern Mexico, Battle of Monterrey, led by Zachary Taylor. 2,300 U.S. troops crossed the Rio Grande after some initial difficulties in obtaining river transport. His soldiers occupied Matamoros, then Camargo, where the soldiery suffered the first of many problems with disease, and then proceeded south and besieged the city of Monterrey, Nuevo Leon. The hard-fought Battle of Monterrey resulted in serious losses on both sides. The U.S. light artillery was ineffective against the stone fortifications of the city, as the American forces attacked in frontal assaults. The Mexican forces under General Pedro de Ampudia repulsed Taylor's best infantry division at Fort Teneria. American soldiers, including many West Point graduates, had never engaged in urban warfare before, and they marched straight down the open streets, where they were annihilated by Mexican defenders, well hidden in Monterrey's thick adobe homes. They quickly learned. 2 days later, they changed their urban warfare tactics. Texan soldiers had fought in a Mexican city before, the Siege of Bexar in December 1835, and advised Taylor's generals that the Americans needed to mouse hole through the city's homes. They needed to punch holes in the side or roofs of the homes and fight hand-to-hand inside the structures. Mexicans called the Texas soldiers the Diabolicos Tejanos, the Devil Texans. This method proved successful. Eventually, these actions drove and trapped Ampudia's men into the city's central plaza, where howitzer shelling forced Ampudia to negotiate. Taylor agreed to allow the Mexican army to evacuate and to an 8-week armistice in return for the surrender of the city. Taylor broke the armistice and occupied the city of Saltillo, southwest of Monterrey. Santa Anna blamed the loss of Monterrey and Saltillo on Ampudia and demoted him to command a small artillery battalion. Similarly, Polk blamed Taylor both for suffering heavy losses and failing to imprison Ampudia's entire force. Taylor's army was subsequently stripped of most of its troops in order to support the coming coastal operations by Scott against Veracruz and the Mexican heartland. Battle of Buna Vista on February 22, 1847. Having heard of this weakness from Prachi 7. Having heard of this weakness from the written orders found on an ambushed U.S. scout, Santa Anna seized the initiative and marched Mexico's entire army north to fight Taylor with 20,000 men, hoping to win a smashing victory before Scott could invade from the sea. The two armies met and fought the largest battle of the war at the Battle of Buena Vista. Taylor, with 4,600 men, had entrenched at a mountain pass called La Angostura, or the Narrows, several miles south of Buena Vista Ranch. Santa Anna, having little logistics to supply his army, suffered desertions all the long march north and arrived with only 15,000 men in a tired state. Having demanded and been refused the surrender of the U.S. Army, Santa Anna's army attacked the next morning, using a ruse in the battle with the U.S. forces. Santa Anna flanked the U.S. positions by sending his cavalry and some of his infantry up the steep terrain that made up one side of the pass, while a division of infantry attacked frontally to distract and draw out the U.S. forces along the road leading to Buena Vista. Furious fighting ensued, during which the U.S. troops were nearly routed but managed to cling to their entrenched position. Thanks to the Mississippi Rifles, a volunteer regiment led by Jefferson Davis, who formed them into a defensive V formation. The Mexicans had nearly broken the American lines at several points, but their infantry columns, navigating the narrow pass, suffered heavily from the American horse artillery, fired point-blank canister shots to break up the attacks. Initial reports of the battle, as well as propaganda from the Sandinistas, credited the victory to the Mexicans, much to the joy of the Mexican populace. But rather than attack the next day and finish the battle, Santa Anna retreated, losing men along the way, having heard word of rebellion and upheaval in Mexico City. Taylor was left in control of part of northern Mexico, and Santa Anna later faced criticism for his withdrawal. Mexican and American military historians who, alike, agree that the U.S. Army could likely have been defeated if Santa Anna had fought the battle to its finish. Polk mistrusted Taylor, who he felt had shown incompetence in the Battle of Monterrey. By agreeing to the armistice, Taylor later used the Battle of Buena Vista as the centerpiece of his successful 1848 presidential campaign. Northwestern Mexico. Northwestern Mexico was essentially tribal native territory. But on November 21, 1846, the Bear Springs Treaty was signed, ending a large-scale insurrection by the Ute, Zuni, Moquis, Kay, and Navajo tribes. In December 1846, after the successful conquest of New Mexico, part of Kearny's Army of the West, the 1st Missouri Mounted Volunteers moved into modern-day northwest Mexico. They were led by Alexander W. Doniphan, continuing what ended up being a year-long 5,500-mile campaign. It was described as rivaling Xenophon's march across Anatolia during the Greco-Persian Wars. On Christmas Day, they won the Battle of El Brasido outside the modern-day El Paso, Texas on March 1, 1847. Doniphan occupied Chihuahua City. British Consul John Potts did not want to allow Doniphan to search Governor Trias' mansion and unsuccessfully asserted it was under British protection. American merchants in Chihuahua wanted the American force to stay in order to protect their business. Major William Gilpin advocated a march on Mexico City and convinced a majority of officers, but Doniphan subverted this plan. Then, in late April, Taylor ordered the 1st Missouri Mounted Volunteers to leave Chihuahua and join him at Saltillo. The American merchants either followed or returned to Santa Fe. Along the way, the townspeople of Piras enlisted Doniphan's aid against a native raiding party that had taken children, horses, mules, and money. The Missouri Volunteers, finally, made their way to Matamoros, from which they returned to Missouri by water. The civilian population of northern Mexico offered little resistance to the American invasion, possibly because the country had already been devastated by Comanche and Apache native raids. Josiah Gregg, who was with the American Army in northern Mexico, said the whole country from New Mexico to the borders of Durango is almost entirely depopulated. The haciendas and ranchos have been mostly abandoned and the people chiefly confined to the towns and cities. Southern Mexico had a large indigenous population and was geographically distant from the capital, over which the central government had weak control. Yucatan in particular had closer ties to Cuba and to the United States than it did to central Mexico. On a number of occasions in the early era of the Mexican Republic, Yucatan seceded from the Federation. There were also rivalries between regional elites, with one faction based in Mérida and the other in Campeche. These issues factored into the Mexican-American War. As the U.S. had designs on this part of the coast, the U.S. Navy contributed to the war by controlling the coast and clearing the way for U.S. troops and supplies, especially to Mexico's main port of Veracruz. Even before hostilities began in the disputed northern region, the U.S. Navy created a blockade. Given the shallow waters of that portion of the coast, the U.S. Navy needed ships with a shallow draft rather than large frigates. Since the Mexican Navy was almost non-existent, the U.S. Navy could operate unimpeded in Gulf waters. The U.S. fought 2 battles in Tabasco in October 1846 and in June 1847. These views were later supported by the Knights of the Golden Circle, of which Davis was allegedly a member. In the end, the U.S. did not intervene in Yucatan, but it had figured in congressional debates about the Mexican-American War. At one point, the government of Yucatan petitioned the U.S. for protection during the Caste War, but the U.S. did not respond. Scott's invasion of Mexico's heartland landings and siege of Veracruz. Rather than reinforce Taylor's army for a continued advance. President Polk sent a second army under General Winfield Scott. Polk had decided that the way to bring the war to an end was to invade the Mexican heartland from the coast. General Scott's army was transported to the port of Veracruz by sea to begin an invasion to take the Mexican capital, Mexico City. On March 9, 1847. Scott performed the first major amphibious landing in U.S. history in preparation for a siege. A. Group of 12,000 volunteer and regular soldiers successfully offloaded supplies, weapons, and horses near the walled city using specially designed landing crafts. Included in the invading force were several future generals: Robert E. Lee, George Meade, Ulysses S. Grant, James Longstreet, and Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Veracruz was defended by Mexican General Juan Morales, with 3,400 men, mortar, and naval. Guns under Commodore Matthew C. Perry were used to reduce the city walls and harass defenders. The bombardment on March 24, 1847, opened in the walls of Veracruz a 30-foot gap. The defenders in the city replied with their own artillery. But the extended barrage broke the will of the Mexicans, who faced a numerically superior force, and they surrendered the city after 12 days under siege. U.S. troops suffered 80 casualties, while the Mexicans had around 180 killed and wounded, with hundreds of civilians killed. During the siege, the U.S. soldiers began to fall victim to yellow fever. Advance on Puebla. Santa Anna allowed Scott's army to march inland, counting on yellow fever and other tropical diseases to take their toll before Santa Anna chose a place to engage the enemy. Mexico had used this tactic before, including when Spain attempted to reconquer Mexico in 1829. Disease could be a decisive factor in the war. Santa Anna was from Veracruz, so he was on his home territory, knew the terrain, and had a network of allies. He could draw on local resources to feed his hungry army and gain intelligence on the enemy's movements. From his experience in the northern battles on open terrain, Santa Anna sought to negate the U.S. Army's primary advantage: its use of artillery. Santa Anna chose Cerro Gordo as the place to engage the U.S. troops, calculating the terrain would offer the maximum advantage for the Mexican forces. Scott marched westward on April 2, 1847, toward Mexico City with 8,500 initially healthy troops, while Santa Anna set up a defensive position in a canyon around the main road and prepared fortifications. Santa Anna had entrenched with what the U.S. Army believed were 12,000 troops, but in fact was around 9,000. He had artillery trained on the road where he expected Scott to appear. However, Scott had sent 2,600 mounted dragoons ahead, and they reached the pass on April 12. The Mexican artillery prematurely fired on them and therefore revealed their positions. Beginning the skirmish, instead of taking the main road, Scott's troops trekked through the rough terrain to the north, setting up his artillery on the high ground and quietly flanking the Mexicans. Although by then aware of the positions of U.S. troops, Santa Anna and his troops were unprepared for the onslaught that followed. In the battle fought on April 18th, the Mexican army was routed. The U.S. Army suffered 400 casualties, while the Mexicans suffered over 1,000 casualties, with 3,000 taken prisoner. In August 1847, Captain Kirby Smith of Scott's 3rd Infantry reflected on the resistance of the Mexican army. They can do nothing, and their continued defeats should convince them of it. They have lost 6 great battles. We have captured 600 and 8 cannon, nearly 100,000 stands of arms, made 20,000 prisoners, have the greatest portion of their country, and are fast advancing on their capital, which must be ours, yet they refuse to treat. The U.S. Army had expected a quick collapse of the Mexican forces. Santa Anna, however, was determined to fight to the end. and Mexican soldiers continued to regroup after battles to fight yet again. Pause at Puebla. On May 1, 1847, Scott pushed on to Puebla, the second largest city in Mexico. The city capitulated without resistance. The Mexican defeat at Cerro Gordo had demoralized Puebla's inhabitants, and they worried about harm to their city and inhabitants. It was standard practice in warfare for victorious soldiers to be let loose to inflict horrors on civilian populations if they resisted. The threat of this was often used as a bargaining tool to secure surrender without a fight. Scott had orders which aimed to prevent his troops from such violence and atrocities. Puebla's ruling elite also sought to prevent violence, as did the Catholic Church. But Puebla's poor and working class wanted to defend the city. U.S. Army troops, who strayed outside at night, were often killed. Enough Mexicans were willing to sell supplies to the U.S. Army to make local provisioning possible. During the following months, Scott gathered supplies and reinforcements at Puebla and sent back units whose enlistments had expired. Scott also made strong efforts to keep his troops disciplined and treat the Mexican people under occupation justly, to keep good order and prevent any popular uprising against his army. Advance on Mexico City and its capture with guerrillas harassing his line of communications back to Veracruz. Scott decided not to weaken his army to defend Puebla, but leaving only a garrison at Puebla to protect the sick and injured recovering there. Advanced on Mexico City on August 7th with his remaining force. The capital was laid open in a series of battles around the right flank of the city defenses, the Battle of Contreras and Battle of Churubusco. After Churubusco, fighting halted for an armistice and peace negotiations, which broke down on September 6, 1847, with the subsequent battles of Molino del Rey and of Chapultepec, and the storming of the city gates. The capital was occupied. Scott became military governor of occupied Mexico City. His victories in this campaign made him an American national hero. The Battle of Chapultepec in September 1847 was a siege on the castle of Chapultepec, built on a hill in Mexico City in the colonial era. At this time, this castle was a renowned military school in the capital. After the battle, which ended in a victory for the U.S., the legend of Los Niños Heroes was born, although not confirmed by historians. 6 military cadets between the ages of 13 and 17 stayed in the school instead of evacuating. They decided to stay and fight for Mexico. These Niños Roseboy heroes became icons in Mexico's patriotic pantheon. Rather than surrender to the U.S. Army, some military cadets leaped from the castle walls. A cadet named Juan Escutia wrapped himself in the Mexican flag and jumped to his death. Santa Anna's last campaign, in late September 1847. Santa Anna made one last attempt to defeat the U.S. Army by cutting them off from the coast. General Joaquin began the siege of Puebla, soon joined by Santa Anna. Scott had left some 2,400 soldiers in Puebla, of whom around 400 were fit. After the fall of Mexico City, Santa Anna hoped to rally Puebla's civilian population against the U.S. soldiers under siege and subject to guerrilla attacks. Before the Mexican army could wipe out the Americans in Puebla, more troops landed in Veracruz under the command of Brigadier General Joseph Lane. At Puebla, they sacked the town. Santa Anna was not able to provision his troops, who effectively dissolved as a fighting force to forage for food. Puebla was relieved by Lane on October 12th. Following his defeat of Santa Anna at the Battle of Huamantla on October 9th, the battle was Santa Anna's last occupation of Mexico City following the capture of the capital. The Mexican government moved to the temporary capital at Querétaro, in Mexico City. US forces became an army of occupation and subject to stealth attacks. From the urban population, conventional warfare gave way to guerrilla warfare by Mexicans defending their homeland. They inflicted significant casualties on the U.S. Army, particularly on soldiers slow to keep up. General Scott sent about a quarter of his strength to secure his line of communications to Veracruz from the light corps of General Ree and other Mexican guerrilla forces that had made stealth attacks since May. Mexican guerrillas often tortured and mutilated the bodies of the U.S. troops. As revenge and warning, Scott viewed guerrilla attacks as contrary to the laws of war and threatened the property of populations that appeared to harbor the guerrillas. Captured guerrillas were to be shot, including helpless prisoners, with the reasoning that the Mexicans did the same. Historian Peter Gardino contends that the U.S. Army Command was complicit in the attacks against Mexican civilians. By threatening the civilian population's homes, property, and families with burning whole villages, looting and raping women, the U.S. Army separated guerrillas from their base. Guerrillas cost the Americans dearly, but indirectly cost Mexican civilians more. Scott strengthened the garrison of Puebla, and by November had added a 1,200-man garrison at Jalapa, established 750-man posts along the main route between the port of Veracruz and the capital, at the pass between Mexico City and Puebla at Rio Frio, at Perote and San Juan on the road between Jalapa and Puebla, and at Punta Naciano between Jalapa and Veracruz. He had also detailed an anti-guerrilla brigade under Lane to carry the war to the light corps and other guerrillas. He ordered that convoys would travel with at least 1,300-man escorts. Victories by Lane over the light corps at Atlixco, October 18, 1847. At Izúcar de Matamoros, November 23, 1847. And at Galaxura Pass, November 24, 1847, weakened General Ree's forces. Later a raid against the guerrillas of Padre Girata at Zacualtipan, February 25, 1848. Further reduced guerrilla raids on the American line of communications. After the two governments concluded a truce to await ratification of the peace treaty, on March 6, 1848, formal hostilities ceased. However, some bands continued in defiance of the Mexican government until the U.S. Army's evacuation in August 214. Some were suppressed by the Mexican Army or, like Padre Girata, executed. Desertion was a major problem for both armies. In the Mexican Army, desertions depleted forces on the eve of battle. Most soldiers were peasants who had a loyalty to their village and family, but not to the generals who had conscripted them. Often hungry and ill, under-equipped, only partially trained, and underpaid. The soldiers were held in contempt by their officers and had little reason to fight the Americans. Looking for their opportunity, many slipped away from camp to find their way back to their home village. The desertion rate in the U.S. Army was 8.3%, 9,200 out of 111,000, compared to 12.7% during the War of 1812 and usual peacetime rates of about 14.8%. Per year, many men deserted to join another U.S. unit and get a second enlistment bonus. Some deserted because of the miserable conditions in camp. It has been suggested that others used the Army to get free transportation to California, where they deserted to join the gold rush. This, however, is unlikely, as gold was only discovered in California on January 24, 1848, less than 2 weeks before the war concluded. By the time word reached the eastern U.S. that gold had been discovered, word also reached it that the war was over. Hundreds of U.S. deserters went over to the Mexican side. Nearly all were recent immigrants from Europe with weak ties to the The Mexicans issued broadsides and leaflets enticing U.S. soldiers with promises of money, land bounties, and officers' commissions. Mexican guerrillas shadowed the U.S. Army and captured men who took unauthorized leave or fell out of the ranks. The guerrillas sometimes coerced these men to join the Mexican ranks. Thousands of other U.S. soldiers simply deserted. San Patricios, the most famous group of deserters from the U.S. Army, was the St. Patrick's Battalion, or San Patricios, composed primarily of several hundred immigrant soldiers, the majority Catholic, Irish, and German immigrants, who deserted the U.S. Army because of ill treatment or sympathetic leanings to fellow Mexican Catholics and joined the Mexican Army. The battalion also included Canadians, English, French, Italians, Poles, Scots, Spaniards, Swiss, and Mexican people, many of whom were members of the Catholic Church. Asterisk, most of the battalion were killed in the Battle of Churubusco. About 100 were captured by the U.S., and roughly half of the San Patricios were tried and were hanged as deserters following their capture at Churubusco in August 1847. The leader, John Riley, was branded. A bust of John Riley and a plaque on the facade of a building in Plaza San Jacinto, San Angel commemorates the place where they were hanged. Asterisk, end of war. Terms of peace asterisk outnumbered militarily and with many large cities of the Mexican heartland, including its capital, occupied. Mexico could not defend itself in conventional warfare. Mexico faced many continuing internal divisions between factions, so that bringing the war to a formal end was not straightforward. Although there were complications with the negotiating peace on both ends. Peace came in Alta California in January 1847 with the Treaty of Cahuenga, with the Californios Mexican residents of Alta California capitulating to the American forces. A more comprehensive peace treaty was needed to end the conflict. Asterisk. The U.S. forces had gone from being an army of conquest on the periphery for territory it desired to incorporate, to an invading force in central Mexico, potentially making it an army of long-term occupation. Mexico did not necessarily have to sign a peace treaty, but could have continued with long-term guerrilla warfare against the U.S. Army. However, it could not expel the invaders, so negotiating a treaty became more necessary. Asterisk, Polk's wish for a short war of conquest against a perceived weak enemy with no will to fight had turned into a long and bloody conflict in Mexico's heartland. Negotiating a treaty was in the best interest of the United States. It was not easy to achieve. Polk lost confidence in his negotiator Nicholas Trist and dismissed him as peace negotiations dragged on. Trist ignored the fact that he no longer had the authorization to act for the United States. When Trist managed to get yet another Mexican government to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Polk was presented with an accomplished fact and decided to take it to Congress for ratification. Ratification was a daunting task, since the Democrats had lost the elections of 1846, and Whigs opposed to the war were now in ascendance, All Mexico movement having won a decisive victory. The U.S. was divided on what the peace should entail. Now that the U.S. had gone far beyond the territorial gains it initially envisioned by invading central Mexico with its dense population, the question was raised whether to annex the entirety of Mexico. After the Wilmot Proviso, there was a lessening of fervor for the idea. But the taking of Mexico City had revived enthusiasm. There were fierce objections in Congress to that on racial grounds. South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun argued that absorbing Mexico would threaten U.S. institutions and the character of the country. We have never dreamt of incorporating into our union any but the Caucasian race, the free white race. 2. Incorporate Mexico would be the first instance of the kind of incorporating an Indian race. For more than half of the Mexicans are Indians, and the other is composed chiefly of mixed tribes. I protest against such a union as that. Ours, sir, is the government of a white race, ... We are anxious to force free government on all. And I see that it has been urged that it is the mission of this country to spread civil and religious liberty over all the world, and especially over this continent. It is a great mistake. Asterisk beyond the racial argument, Calhoun contended that the U.S. could not be both an empire and a republic, and he argued that being an empire would strengthen the central government and be detrimental to individual states. Rhode Island Whig Senator John Clark also objected to annexing all of Mexico. To incorporate such a disjointed and degraded mass into even a limited participation with our social and political rights would be fatally destructive to the institutions of our country. There is a moral pestilence to such a people, which is contagious, a leprosy that will destroy us. Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on February 2, 1848. By diplomat Nicholas Trist and Mexican plenipotentiary representatives Luis G. Cuevas, Bernardo Couto, and Miguel Atristán, ended the war. The treaty gave the U.S. undisputed control of Texas, established the U.S.-Mexican border along the Rio Grande, and ceded to the United States the present-day states of California, Nevada, and Utah, most of New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado, and parts of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming. In return, Mexico received $15 million, $545 million today, less than half the amount the U.S. had attempted to offer Mexico for the land before the opening of hostilities, and the U.S. agreed to assume $3.25 million, $118 million today, in debts that the Mexican government owed to U.S. citizens. The area of domain acquired was given by the Federal Interagency Committee as 338,680,960 acres, 529,189 square miles. The cost was $16,295,149, or approximately 5 cents per acre. The area amounted to one-third of Mexico's original territory from its 1821 independence. Asterisk. The treaty was ratified by the U.S. Senate by a vote of 38 to 14 on March 10 and by Mexico through a legislative vote of 51 to 34 and a Senate vote of 33 to 4. On May 19, news that New Mexico's Legislative Assembly had passed an act for the organization of a U.S. territorial government helped ease Mexican concern about abandoning the people of New Mexico. Asterisk, the acquisition was a source of controversy, especially among U.S. politicians who had opposed the war from the start. A leading anti-war U.S. newspaper, the Whig National Intelligencer, sardonically concluded that we take nothing by conquest. Thank God. Asterisk, the acquired lands west of the Rio Grande are traditionally called the Mexican Cession in the U.S., as opposed to the Texas annexation 2 years earlier. Though the division of New Mexico down the middle at the Rio Grande never had any basis either in control or Mexican boundaries, Mexico never recognized the independence of Texas before the war and did not cede its claim to territory north of the Rio Grande or Gila River until this treaty. Before ratifying the treaty, the U.S. Senate made 2 modifications, changing the wording of Article 9, which guaranteed Mexicans living in the purchased territories the right to become U.S. citizens, and striking out Article 10, which conceded the legitimacy of land grants made by the Mexican government. On May 26, 1848, when the 2 countries exchanged ratifications of the treaty, they further agreed to a 3-article protocol known as the Protocol of Querétaro to explain the amendments. The first article claimed that the original Article 9 of the treaty, although replaced by Article 3 of the Treaty of Louisiana, would still confer the rights delineated in Article 9. The second article confirmed the legitimacy of land grants under Mexican law. The protocol was signed in the city of Querétaro by A.H. de Sevier, Nathan Clifford, and Luis de la Rosa. Asterisk, Article 11 offered a potential benefit to Mexico, in that the U.S. pledged to suppress the Comanche and Apache raids that had ravaged the region and pay restitution to the victims of raids it could not prevent. However, the native raids did not cease for several decades after the treaty. Although a cholera epidemic in 1849 greatly reduced the numbers of the Comanche, Robert Letcher, U.S. Minister to Mexico in 1850, was certain that miserable 11th article would lead to the financial ruin of the U.S. if it could not be released from its obligations. The U.S. was released from all obligations of Article 11. 5 years later, by Article 2 of the Gadsden Purchase of 1853. Aftermath altered territories before the secession of Texas. Mexico comprised almost 1,700,000 square miles, 4,400,000 square kilometers. But by 1849, it covered just under 800,000 square miles, 2,100,000 square kilometers. Another 30,000 square miles, 78,000 square kilometers, were sold to the U.S. in the Gadsden Purchase of 1853. A total reduction in Mexican territory of more than 55%, or 900,000 square miles, 2,300,000 square kilometers. Although the annexed territory was about the size of Western Europe, it was sparsely populated. The land contained about 14,000 non-indigenous people in Alta California, about 60,000 in Nuevo Mexico, as well as large native nations such as the Papago, Pima, Pueblo, Navajo, Apache, and many others, although some native people relocated. Farther south in Mexico, the great majority remained in the U.S. territory. The U.S. settlers surging into the newly conquered Southwest replaced Mexican law, a civil law system based on the law of Spain, which, in the law of April 6, 1830, forbade any further immigration. However, they recognized the value of a few aspects of Mexican law and carried them over into their new legal systems. For example, most of the southwestern states adopted community property marital property systems, as well as water law. Many Mexicans, including mestizos, Afro-Mexicans, and indigenous peoples in the annexed territories, experienced a loss of civil and political rights. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo promised U.S. citizenship to all former Mexican citizens living in the territories. However, the United States gave ceded states the authority to establish citizenship policy. And within a year, states were passing laws that banned all Mexicans in Arizona, California, New Mexico, and Texas from U.S. citizenship, except white male Mexicans. Furthermore, non-white Mexicans lost certain citizenship rights, such as the right to practice law, vote, or hold certain government positions. Indigenous peoples lost land rights and were exterminated, as in the California genocide, or forced into reservations. Mexico lost part of its northern territories in Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming that included few, if any, Mexicans and many indigenous groups. Asterisk, furthermore, the U.S. government did not grant full citizenship to Native Americans in the Southwest until the 1930s, even though they were Mexican citizens. Asterisk, the California Constitution of 1849 conferred voting rights only to white male citizens, Article 2, Section 1. And the number of senators was proportioned only according to the number of white inhabitants, Article 4, Section 29. Effect on the United States in much of the United States. Victory and the acquisition of new land brought a surge of patriotism. Victory seemed to fulfill Democrats' belief in their country's manifest destiny. Although the Whigs had opposed the war, they made Zachary Taylor their presidential candidate in the election of 1848, praising his military performance while muting their criticism of the war. Has the Mexican War terminated yet? And how? Are we beaten? Do you know of any nation about to besiege South Hadley, Massachusetts? If so, do inform me of it, for I would be glad of a chance to escape if we are to be stormed. I suppose our teacher, Miss Mary Lyon, founder of Mount Holyoke College, would furnish us all with daggers and order us to fight for our lives. The 16-year-old Emily Dickinson. Writing to her older brother, Austin, in the fall of 1847. Shortly after the Battle of Chapultepec, a month before the end of the war. Polk was criticized in a United States House of Representatives amendment to a bill praising Taylor for a war. unnecessarily and unconstitutionally begun by the President of the United States. This criticism, in which Congressman Abraham Lincoln played an important role with his spot resolutions, followed congressional scrutiny of the war's beginnings, including factual challenges to claims made by President Polk. Asterisk, the vote followed party lines, with all Whigs supporting the amendment. Lincoln's attack won lukewarm support from fellow Whigs in Illinois, but was harshly counterattacked by Democrats, who rallied pro-war sentiments in Illinois. Lincoln's spot resolutions haunted his future campaigns in the heavily Democratic state of Illinois, and were cited by his rivals well into his presidency. Asterisk, while the Whig Emerson rejected war as a means of achieving America's destiny. Toward the end of the war, he wrote, "The United States will conquer Mexico. It will be as the man swallows the arsenic, which brings him down in turn. Mexico will poison us." 254. He later accepted that most of the great results of history are brought about by discreditable means. Asterisk, Civil War historian James M. McPherson dedicates an entire chapter of his Pulitzer-winning Civil War history to the Mexican-American War, entitled "Mexico Will Poison Us." McPherson argues that the Mexican-American War and its aftermath was a key territorial event in the lead-up to the Civil War. Asterisk, veterans of the war were often broken men. As the sick and wounded from Taylor's and Scott's campaigns made their way back from Mexico to the United States, their condition shocked the folks at home. Husbands, sons, and brothers returned in broken health, some with missing limbs. Asterisk, the 1880 Republican campaign textbook by the Republican Congressional Committee describes the war as feculent, reeking corruption, and one of the darkest scenes in our history, a war forced upon our and the Mexican people by the high-handed usurpations of Prest Polk in pursuit of territorial aggrandizement of the slave oligarchy. Following the signing of the 1848 treaty, Polk sought to send troops to Yucatan, where there was a civil war between secessionists and those supporting the Mexican government. The U.S. Congress refused his request. The Mexican War was supposed to be short and nearly bloodless. It was neither. Congress did not support more foreign conflict. Effect on the American military in the Civil War. Many of the military leaders on both sides of the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865 had trained at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and had fought as junior officers in Mexico. This list includes military men fighting for the Union: Ulysses S. Grant, George B. McClellan, William T. Sherman, George Meade, and Ambrose Burnside. Military men who joined the Southern secessionists of the Confederacy included Robert E. Lee, Albert Sidney Johnston, Stonewall Jackson, James Longstreet, Joseph E. Johnston, Braxton Bragg, Sterling Price, and the future Confederate President, Jefferson Davis. Both sides had leaders with significant experience in active combat, strategy, and tactics. Asterisk for Grant, who went on to lead Union forces in the Civil War and later was elected president. It also tutored him in the manifold ways wars are shot through with political calculations. 260. Grant had served in Mexico under General Zachary Taylor and was appointed acting assistant quartermaster for Taylor's army, a post he tried to decline since it took him away from the battlefield. However, the appointment was actually a godsend for Grant, turning him into a complete soldier, adept at every facet of Army life, especially logistics. This provided invaluable training for the Civil War, when Grant would need to sustain gigantic armies in the field, distant from northern supply depots. 261. Grant saw considerable combat and demonstrated his coolness under fire. In the Battle of Chapultepec, he and his men hoisted a howitzer into a church belfry that had a commanding view of the San Cosme Gate. The action brought him the honorary rank of brevet captain for gallant and meritorious conduct in the Battle of Chapultepec. Asterisk Grant later recalled in his memoirs, published in 1885, that generally, The officers of the Army were indifferent whether the annexation of Texas was consummated or not. But not so all of them. For myself, I was bitterly opposed to the measure, and to this day regard the war which resulted as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. It was an instance of a republic following the bad example of European monarchies in not considering justice in their desire to acquire additional territory. Grant also expressed the view that the war against Mexico had brought punishment on the United States in the form of the American Civil War. The Southern Rebellion was largely the outgrowth of the Mexican War. Nations, like individuals, are punished for their transgressions. We got our punishment in the most sanguinary and expensive war of modern times. Asterisk Robert E. Lee, commander of the Confederate forces through the end of the Civil War, began building his reputation as a military officer in America's war against Mexico. At the start of the Mexican-American War, Captain Lee invaded Mexico with General Wool's engineering department from the north. By early 1847, he helped take the Mexican cities of Veracruz, Cerro Gordo, Contreras, Churubusco, Molino del Rey, and Chapultepec. Lee was wounded in Chapultepec. General Scott described Robert E. Lee as gallant and indefatigable, saying that Lee had displayed the greatest feat of physical and moral courage performed by any individual in his knowledge during the campaign. Asterisk Grant gained insight into Robert E. Lee, as his memoir states, "I had known him personally and knew that he was mortal. And it was just as well that I felt this." Asterisk in 1861. General Scott advised Abraham Lincoln to ask Lee to command U.S. forces. Lee declined and later recounted, "I declined the offer he made me to take command of the army that was brought into the field," stating candidly and as courteously, "As I could that, though opposed to secession and deprecating war, I could take no part in the invasion of the Southern states." Social and political context, despite initial objections from the Whigs and from abolitionists. The Mexican War, nevertheless, united the U.S. in a common cause and was fought almost entirely by volunteers. The United States Army swelled from just over 6,000 to more than 115,000, the majority of 12-month volunteers in Scott's Army decided that a year's fighting was enough and returned to the U.S. Anti-slavery elements fought for the exclusion of slavery from any territory absorbed by the U.S. in 1847. The House of Representatives passed the Wilmot Proviso, stipulating that none of the territory acquired should be open to slavery. If successful, the Wilmot Proviso would have effectively canceled out the 1820 Missouri Compromise, since it would have prohibited slavery in an area below the parallel 3,630 north. The Senate avoided the issue, and a late attempt to add it to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was defeated because Southern senators had the votes to prevent its addition. The House of Representatives is apportioned by population, and the North's was growing, allowing it to win the majority of the House in the 1846 elections. But the Senate representation is 2 per state, and Southerners had enough votes to block the addition. Politically, the war shaped many viewpoints from American racial and gender superiority. The war linked masculinity and citizenship and encouraged violence and control over those considered inferior, whilst white Americans gained more rights. Racism became more prominent against immigrant groups as they made up regiments and were often looked down upon. Asterisk, racial prejudice became prevalent within and after the war with Mexicans alongside Native Americans being looked down upon and unable to work within an American democracy or as citizens. This caused anti-imperialism within the United States to rise, with some even viewing the war as shameful. Asterisk. Debate was waged over the war and its conduct, with some authors supporting it, whilst others covering its lack of morality. The consequences of the war would remain and would lead to political settlements between slavery and non-slavery states with the South, pushing to expand slavery overseas, and this would lead to American Civil War and influence the Union's diplomacy. With European states, the war proved a decisive event for the U.S., marking a significant turning point for the nation as a growing military power. It is also a milestone in the U.S. narrative of manifest destiny. The war did not resolve the issue of slavery in the U.S., but rather in many ways inflamed it, as potential westward expansion of the institution became an increasingly central and heated theme in national debates, by extending the territory of the United States to the Pacific Ocean. The end of the Mexican-American War marked a new step in the huge migrations of Americans to the West. Veterans of the war following the Civil War. Veterans of the Mexican War began to organize themselves as veterans, regardless of rank, and lobbied for their service. Initially, they sought to create a soldier's home for aged and ailing veterans, but then began pushing for pensions in 1874. There was resistance in Congress since veterans had received warrants for up to 160 acres of 160 acres of land for their service. Pensions would have put a fiscal strain on the government. The politics were complicated since so many veterans of the Mexican War fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War. Republican congressmen accused them of attempting to give federal aid to former Confederates. This led to a 13-year congressional debate over the loyalty of the veterans and their worthiness to receive federal assistance in their declining years. In 1887, the Mexican Veteran Pension Law went into effect, making veterans eligible for a pension for their service. Surviving officers and enlisted men were placed on a pension roll, which included volunteers, militias, and Marines who had served at least 60 days and were at least 62 years old. Widows of veterans who had not remarried were eligible for their late husband's pension. Excluded was any person while under the political disabilities imposed by the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. That is, veterans who had fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War. Incidents, civilian deaths, and massacres at the beginning of the war. U.S. troops under Taylor's command adhered to the rules of war for the most part, under the watchful eye of Taylor, and almost exclusively engaged with enemy soldiers. This gained them some popularity with Mexican civilians, who held the occupying Americans in a degree of high regard compared to the Mexican army, who left their wounded to be captured by the enemy as they retreated from the area. In June 1846, the situation changed when American reinforcements entered the area and began raiding local farms. Many soldiers on garrison duty began committing crimes against civilians, such as robbery, rape, and murder, in order to alleviate their boredom. This wave of wanton crime resulted in American soldiers murdering at least 20 civilians during the first month of occupation. Taylor initially showed little concern with the crimes the soldiers were committing and failed to discipline the soldiers responsible for them or devise ways to prevent crimes. This led to public opinion turning against the U.S. troops and resulted in many Mexicans taking up arms and forming guerrilla bands which attacked patrols of U.S. soldiers. The attacks continued to get more prevalent, especially after the Battle of Monterrey. During this time, anti-Catholic sentiment and racism fueled further attacks against Mexican civilians. It was estimated that U.S. troops killed at least 100 civilians, with the majority of them being killed by the 1st Texas Mounted Volunteers commanded by Colonel John C. Hayes. U.S. troops under the command of Capt. Mabry B. Mustang Gray responded to the killing of an American soldier outside of Monterrey by Mexicans by abducting and summarily executing 24 unarmed Mexican civilians. In November 1846, a detachment from the 1st Kentucky Regiment murdered a young Mexican boy, ostensibly as a form of sport. Afterwards, Taylor failed to bring charges against any of the soldiers involved. The most infamous incident occurred on October 9, 1847, after Captain Samuel Hamilton Walker and 12 others were killed in a skirmish. Joseph Lane ordered his men to avenge the dead Texas Rangers by sacking the town of Wilmotla. The soldiers quickly became drunk after raiding a liquor store and began targeting the townspeople, raping and killing dozens of Mexican civilians while indiscriminately burning their homes. Asterisk, however, these reports of an American rampage were overshadowed by the news of Santa Anna's resignation after the Wilmotla attack, leading to no repercussions against Lane or any of the soldiers involved in the atrocities. Effects on Mexico. Asterisk for Mexico, the war had remained a painful historical event for the country, losing territory and highlighting the domestic political conflicts that were to continue for another 20 years. The Reform War between liberals and conservatives in 1857 was followed by the Second French Intervention in 1861, which set up the Second Mexican Empire. The war caused Mexico to enter a period of self-examination, as its leaders sought to identify and address the reasons that had led to such a debacle. In the immediate aftermath of the war, a group of Mexican writers, including Ignacio Ramirez, Guillermo Prieto, Jose Maria Iglesias, compiled a self-serving assessment of the reasons for the war and Mexico's defeat, edited by Mexican Army officer Ramon Alcaraz, denying that Mexican claims to Texas had anything to do with the war. They instead wrote that for the true origin of the war, it is sufficient to say that the insatiable ambition of the United States, favored by our weakness, caused it. The work was noticed and translated to English by Colonel Albert Ramsey, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, and published in the United States in 1850 as a curiosity. Asterisk, despite his being denounced and held to account for Mexico's loss in the war, Santa Anna came to power for one last term as president. After he sold the Mesilla Valley in 1853 to the U.S. in the Gadsden Purchase, he began construction of a transcontinental railway on a better route, but he was ousted and went into a lengthy exile. In exile, he drafted his version of events, which were not published until much later. Legacy Mexico. Asterisk once the French were expelled in 1867 and the Liberal Republic was re-established, Mexico began reckoning with the legacy of the Mexican-American War. The story of the Niños heroes became the narrative that helped Mexicans to come to terms with the war. Boy cadets sacrificing themselves for their patria fatherland as martyrs in the Battle of Chapultepec was inspiring. But their sacrifice was not commemorated until 1881, when surviving cadets formed an organization to support the Military Academy of Mexico. One of the cadets taken prisoner designed the monument. A small cenotaph was erected at the base of Chapultepec Hill, on which the castle is built. Annual commemorations at the cenotaph were attended by General Porfirio Diaz, who saw the opportunity to build his relationship with the Federal Army. Even during the Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920, the commemoration was continued and attended by contemporary presidents. After the end of the military phase, the Mexican government renewed the narrative of the boy heroes as the embodiment of sacrifice for the patria. Plans were drawn up for a much larger commemoration of their sacrifice, which was built at the entrance to Mexico City's Chapultepec Park. The monument to the heroic cadets was inaugurated in 1952. By then, relations between the U.S. and Mexico had improved so much that they had been allies in World War II, and their post-war economies became increasingly intertwined. Some war trophies taken by the U.S., such as Mexican battle flags, were returned to Mexico with considerable ceremony. But captured U.S. flags remain in Mexico. In 1981, the Mexican government established the Museo Nacional de las Intervenciones, National Museum of Interventions, in a former convent that was the site of the Battle of Churubusco. It chronicles the attempts by the Spanish to reconquer Mexico after its independence, as well as the French interventions. The museum has an exhibition on the Intervention Norteamericana de Iba Salil, which chronicles the Anglo-American settlement of Texas and their rebellion after characterizing themselves as victims of Mexican oppression. It goes on to blame the war on Polk and Santa Anna. The museum's interpretation concedes U.S. military superiority in arms and commanders while disparaging General Santa Anna's costly mistakes and retreat from the capital city. United States and the U.S. The war was almost forgotten after the cataclysm of the Civil War. 287, however. One of the first monuments was erected on the State House grounds in South Carolina in 1858, celebrating the Palmetto Regiment. As veterans of the Civil War saw the scale of commemorations of that war, Mexican war veterans sought remembrance for their service. In 1885, tableau of the U.S. Army's entry into Mexico City was painted in the U.S. Capitol building by Filippo Constagini. The Marine Corps hymn, which includes the phrase "From the halls of Montezuma," is an acknowledgement of the war. But there are no major monuments or memorials. Mexico City is the site of a cemetery created in 1851, still maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission. It holds the remains of 1,563 U.S. soldiers, who mainly died in the conflict and were placed in a mass grave. Many more U.S. soldiers died in Mexico, but to transfer bodies there from shallow graves was expensive. A few of those interred died in Mexico City long after the war. The Mexico City Military Cemetery signaled a transition in what the United States understood to be its obligations to its war dead. A pressing issue with the dead of the Civil War. The Mormon Battalion, the only faith-based unit in the war, raised several monuments commemorating their contributions to the war. At the time of the war, most Mormons had been forced out of the jurisdiction of the U.S. and had relocated to Utah. The Mormon leadership realized that stressing their contributions to the war and to realizing manifest destiny was a way to be included in the nation's narrative. A monument to the battalion was dedicated in 1927 on the grounds of the Utah State Capitol grounds in 1927, and one erected in Los Angeles in 1950.